Welcome to Peacebuilding with Dr. Pollack, where I discuss the science of workplace conflict and peace and present short courses with practical techniques to resolve conflicts in daily life. I'm Jeremy Pollack. I'm a social organizational psychologist with a specialty in peace and conflict psychology. I'm also the CEO of Pollack Peacebuilding Systems. We're an international workplace conflict management consulting and training firm, and our online training wing, the Peaceful Leaders Academy. Today's episode is about our psychological tendency to be right and how that tendency fuels conflict. It's designed to help you understand the cognitive underpinnings of this common human drive toward being right, toward rightness, and how it influences workplace conflict, and how we might mitigate its negative effects at work. And really, the techniques apply to almost any situation where conflict emerges as a result of someone's need to be right. You can use these same techniques with clients or vendors, and in your personal life with friends and family as well. I'll also provide a list of the research studies and papers referenced throughout this episode in the description for those who are interested. So let me walk you through what we'll be covering today. We're going to begin by exploring the psychological foundations of why we feel such a strong need to be right. And it's more complex than you might think. Then we're going to examine how various cognitive biases influence our decision-making processes and often reinforce our conviction that we're right, or our conviction toward rightness. From there, we'll look at how the need for rightness, or being right, can escalate into what we call right fighting in the workplace, which often leads to all kinds of destructive conflicts. So we want to be careful about that. We'll also discuss the significant costs that these conflicts can have on organizations, both in terms of productivity and culture. Now, the good news is that there are practical strategies for actually managing this sort of need and its resulting conflicts. So for members of the Peaceful Leaders Club, we'll review a few practical ways to ensure our workplace culture encourages constructive practices to counteract people's need to be right all the time. Throughout this episode, we'll be combining theoretical understanding with practical applications. And I'll make sure you leave with some actionable strategies that you can actually implement in your workplace immediately. Now, there's a fascinating psychology behind our need to be right. This isn't just about ego or stubbornness. It's deeply rooted in how our brains work and our fundamental need for validation. When our beliefs are challenged, something very interesting happens in our brains. We experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, this uncomfortable feeling that we all get if we encounter information that conflicts with our existing beliefs. This was first identified by Leon Festinger in his 1957 book, A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance. And what he explored was the discomfort that we experience when what we believe on the one hand is different or contradicts what we see or hear or observe on the other, and how this dissonance triggers defensive responses. And this is likely because our beliefs are intimately tied to our sense of self-worth and identity. We often identify deeply with our values, our beliefs, our perspectives. So if someone challenges those elements, then that person or that message is, at least in your mind, challenging something fundamental about who you believe you are. And this, of course, can be very upsetting. It can be very uncomfortable. It can be somewhat disorienting, both consciously and unconsciously. So it can put us right into a very defensive mode where we become even more committed to our initial position, to our perspective. And so we sort of entrench ourselves in our rightness. Our typical response is to fight back psychologically against this dissonance and try to be right at all costs. The drive towards being right can drive us towards exploration and curiosity. It can help us learn more and grow in the pursuit of truth, and this is a good thing. But that very same drive, as we're talking about, unfortunately often leads us down a problematic path of defending our position once we firmly establish a belief or a perspective. We do not like to let go of the things that we believe or the things that we think or our perspectives. And to protect these viewpoints from those that would contradict us, we have a whole slew of mental tricks called cognitive biases, which reinforce our viewpoint and dismiss or filter out any perception that contradicts our own. So this reinforcement, this sort of trick that our mind plays on us, creates a cycle where we become more entrenched in our positions. It makes it increasingly difficult to resolve conflicts because it's hard to see someone else's perspective, and it puts us in a sort of an oppositional state with people who push back against our perspectives. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the most common cognitive biases that reinforce our need to be right, and how they help maintain this tendency and indeed our commitment to being right. Cognitive biases are fascinating mental shortcuts that our brains use to navigate this very complex world that we live in. And all of us have these. None of us are safe from them. And they can actually be quite helpful in navigating our environment. There's so much information that our brains need to figure out how to filter in the stuff we need to pay attention to and discard the stuff we don't. But also, of course, these types of heuristics or shortcuts or biases, they can lead us down some troubling paths. And just for context, I'll just reiterate this. We live in this world full of nonstop information. It's hitting our multiple senses all at once, all the time. And without these types of biases or filters, or sometimes we call it mental heuristics, these shortcuts, it would be absolutely impossible to make sense of the world and pay attention to the most relevant and appropriate information. So in this sense, cognitive biases serve as, we might think of them as efficiency tools. They help us make quick decisions without getting overwhelmed by the constant flood of information that we're receiving all the time. However, there's an important catch that we need to understand. Even though they're extremely helpful and they've been a major part of how and why humans have survived and thrived throughout evolutionary history, biases often come with a significant cost to accuracy and objectivity. We can think of these biases as invisible filters that subtly shape how we perceive reality. Just like, a camera filter. It can make a photo look warmer or cooler. Our cognitive biases do the same thing. They color how we see situations and interpret information. Now, the crucial point here is that these biases don't just influence our thinking. They actively reinforce our existing beliefs. So this makes us more convinced of our rightness, or even if we're not totally sure that we're right. So it's something to stay aware of. These are something to dive into and explore a little bit more. Remember, everyone has these biases. They're part of our basic mental architecture. The goal is not to eliminate them. That would be impossible, and it would throw you into psychological chaos. The goal, rather, is to become more aware of how they influence our thinking and our decision-making processes. So I want to highlight just a few of these biases that have been studied in depth so that we can become more aware of their effects relevant to our inclination toward having to be right. So let's start with confirmation bias. This is one of the most pervasive cognitive biases affecting our decision-making and, I would say, also affecting our interpersonal relationships. This is a powerful psychological tendency that all of us experience. It was first identified by Peter Wason in 1960, and it's since been confirmed and explored by hundreds of papers and studies. And it basically identifies this bias that when we hold a belief, our minds naturally gravitate toward information that supports that belief. Just like looking through that filtered lens, that camera lens, we tend to highlight evidence that confirms our existing views while automatically dimming or filtering out contradictory information. Confirmation bias is a form of selective attention, and it can create a potentially destructive feedback loop. Each piece of supporting evidence that we find that makes us more confident in our initial position, our initial rightness, and every contradictory piece of evidence gets dismissed or rationalized away, and this, again, creates this sort of vicious cycle where we are more and more convinced that we're right. And it's particularly problematic in conflict situations where both parties are simultaneously filtering information in or out to support their own side. It makes it very, very hard to get to a place of common ground if both parties or all people involved in the conflict are only allowing in information that confirms what they believe and totally dismissing anything that contradicts their beliefs. One real danger of this is the formation of echo chambers, which are environments where we only expose ourselves to information and to people who agree with us. These types of environments, these echo chambers, make it extremely difficult to consider alternative perspectives or to find common ground with anyone who disagrees with us. Research has consistently shown that confirmation bias significantly impacts our decision-making abilities across virtually all areas of life, from workplace decisions to personal relationships. So being aware of this bias is the first step toward making more balanced and objective judgments. And as we'll see in the upcoming slides, this bias often works in tandem with other cognitive shortcuts, making it even more challenging to overcome our natural tendency to seek out confirmation of our existing beliefs. So let's talk about the anchoring effect. This is another cognitive shortcut or cognitive bias where people's judgments are overly influenced by the first piece of information they encounter. This was first identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two very famous psychologists, in a famous paper on heuristics and biases published in Science, which is one of the most prominent academic journals in 1974. To visualize how this bias works, we can think about an anchor. Just as it holds a ship in place, our initial judgments and first impressions can keep our thinking in a fixed position. When we encounter new information that challenges our initial view, we tend to make only minor adjustments from our initial position rather than completely reconsidering our stance. For example, if we enter a conflict with the belief that a colleague is being deliberately difficult or hostile towards us, we might continue to interpret all their actions through this lens, sort of playing on confirmation bias, even when they make genuine attempts to get along or collaborate, because our perception is anchored. Or if we initially think a particular solution is the best approach, for instance, we might resist exploring any alternatives even when circumstances change or even when we get information that actually would be helpful. Anchoring bias is especially challenging in workplace conflicts because it can create a sort of mental inertia that makes it difficult for either party to move towards resolution. Even when presented with, compelling evidence that contradicts an initial position, we often fail to adjust our thinking in an adequate way. So really important to recognize this tendency, recognize this very common anchoring bias, because if we do, we can make a conscious effort to remain, hopefully, more open-minded, more flexible in our thinking during conflicts, and that will help a lot in finding some common ground or some resolution. So the next time you're trying to resolve a difference of perspectives on something, just try to stay aware of how your perspective or your position may be a bit too rigid based on the first information you got about the situation at hand. All right, let's explore another couple of powerful cognitive biases that I would say significantly impact our fixation on being right. First, the bias blind spot is a fascinating phenomenon where we're remarkably good at identifying biases in others, but remain basically oblivious to our own. Even if we readily identify flaws in thinking that we witness in others, we can't seem to identify our own cognitive flaws. This is the bias blind spot. And it's especially problematic in conflict situations because it makes it quite easy to dismiss valid criticism of our own beliefs or perspectives while holding others' beliefs and perspectives to higher or more rigorous standards than our own. You might think about how all of your arguments against someone else's beliefs sound very valid to you, but their arguments against your beliefs all sound totally invalid or ignorant or something. Now, another related bias is called naive realism. This is our tendency to believe that we see the world as it truly is, objectively and rationally. And we assume that if others disagree with us, it must be because they're either uninformed or irrational or biased themselves. Again, easy to point out others' flaws without seeing our own. And this creates, again, a dangerous cycle where both parties in a conflict are absolutely convinced of their own correctness, their own rightness, and the other's irrationality. These two biases, bias blind spot and naive realism, work together to create a perfect storm in conflict situations. When we combine our inability to see our own biases with our conviction that we're seeing things totally objectively or rationally and that our opponent isn't, it becomes incredibly difficult to find common ground, to resolve disagreements constructively. It's very, very difficult to get out of conflict. Okay, the last bias I think is worth exploring in relationship to our need to be right is a quite fascinating heuristic called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which was identified by researchers Justin-Kruger and David Dunning in a famous 1999 paper published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. This bias shows a peculiar pattern in how people assess their own abilities. Basically, people with low or moderate expertise often overestimate their own competence in some area. And in disagreements or debates, this bias leads individuals to be extra sure that they are right and to dismiss opposing perspectives very, very quickly. If you're watching on video, looking at the graph, you'll notice what's humorously called Mount Stupid, which is that initial peak where people with very little knowledge feel extremely confident about their knowledge or about their abilities. And this is where many workplace conflicts begin, as people, especially people without expertise in a particular subject, often don't realize how much they don't know. And so interestingly, as people gain more knowledge, they typically enter what's called here the valley of despair, where they become acutely aware of their limitations. So the more you know, the more you start to become aware of what you don't know. And this is actually a positive development, even though it could feel like it's not at that time. So the less you know, the more you think you know, and the more you start to know, the more you realize you don't know. So this is this interesting Dunning-Kruger effect. What makes this effect particularly challenging, especially in workplace settings, is that if it's in effect, those with very limited knowledge often speak with the most conviction. They think they're right. And the true experts tend to be more measured in their claims. And this, again, can create a vicious imbalance for conflict, where those who should be listening and learning are instead the most resistant to information and maybe the loudest voices in the room. Being aware of this Dunning-Kruger effect, which is an overconfidence bias, can hopefully help us approach disagreements with more humility, more openness, more ability to learn. And just remember, if you find yourself absolutely certain about something, it might be worth asking whether you're at the peak of Mount Stupid, whether you actually know what you're talking about, and whether or not you've truly mastered the subject matter. Now, when we become entrenched in our need to be right, and our need for rightness or correctness, we set off this, what I would call a destructive chain reaction. It can poison workplace relationships. It can poison productivity. It might start with a simple disagreement, but as people dig in their heels into their positions, situations quickly deteriorate. Instead of listening to understand each other, people begin listening only to formulate their counterarguments, only to defend what they believe or their perspective. And this shift in our ability to listen and stay open or curious is particularly damaging because it prevents any real dialogue from taking place, and dialogue is where conflict resolution happens. And soon, what sort of naturally follows this cycle is an erosion of trust, an erosion of respect, because how can you trust someone who never seems to value your perspective, right? So trust and respect start to just go out the window. And as these fundamental elements of workplace relationships break down, the ability to solve problems creatively, to find common ground, it becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible. You can't brainstorm effectively with someone if you're busy defending yourself against them or their perspective. And perhaps most concerning in these types of cycles is how empathy just basically disappears from these interactions. When we're focused solely on proving our point and digging our heels into being right, we lose sight of the human being on the other side of the argument. We get entrenching ourselves in our positions, which leads to this sort of prolonged conflict that we can't get out of. It almost always leads to some level of dehumanization. The consequences of this behavioral and psychological pattern, being right, entrenching ourselves in positions, leading to dehumanization of some sort, not seeing the other human being, especially with coworkers, the impact of this is far-reaching. It can significantly impact organizational culture and success, outcomes of the organization. For instance, there are several costs that arise when the need to be right dominates workplace dynamics. If you're in this kind of culture, a lot of things can go wrong. Looking at productivity and innovation first, we see a very concerning pattern where valuable time, valuable resources are consumed by unnecessary arguments between people trying to be right. And perhaps even more concerning, people who become hesitant to share innovative ideas with each other or suggest creative solutions because they're afraid that they might face criticism or ridicule. Good ideas a lot of times start to go out the window, and groupthink starts to manifest. And when it comes to culture, if people constantly engage in what I would call right fighting, like fighting to be right, it is the perfect setup for a toxic work environment that leads to stress and anxiety for everyone involved, not just the people trying to be right, but anyone working in that culture. Trust between team members erodes, collaboration becomes increasingly difficult, and the longer this breakdown in team cohesion goes on, the more likely it is to lead to really long-term damage that's hard to repair in the organization. This type of environment, driven by this need to be right, also affects decision-making processes. Instead of decisions being made based on what's best for the organization, they become influenced by who has the most forceful personality or who argues the loudest, whose voice is the loudest. This shifts the focus from strategic thinking and what's beneficial for the organization to personal victories, to ego satisfaction. Not a good setup for organizational success. Because these costs aren't just theoretical. They have real impacts on the bottom line. Decreased productivity, increased turnover, missed opportunities for innovation. All of these are real impacts on the bottom line of the organization. So super important then to figure out how to mitigate the effects of our tendency towards rightness and any resulting destructive dynamics that may come about from it. So let's dive into some of these practical strategies that we can implement to address these issues and hopefully create a more collaborative workplace environment where being right isn't so important. So we've established that much of our interpersonal conflict in general, including conflict at work, often emerges from this fundamental human characteristic, our deep-seated inclination to be right. When we're locked into rightness, we become closed off to new information, closed off to other perspectives, closed off to thinking outside the box. But the good news is this need can be managed effectively if we implement some key approaches. So first, awareness is key. We need to recognize this innate human tendencies so that we can become more conscious of it and possibly interrupt the pattern. Maybe get ourselves out of this intense need to be right for just a moment or two while we're trying to solve something. We also need to foster an environment that inspires and even rewards open communication. This means creating a workplace where team members feel safe to express their views without fear of judgment or retaliation. This is called psychological safety. If we can step outside of our need to be right and into a more open-minded, a more curious space, then our job in an interaction is really to practice active listening. This is crucial. Active or deep listening, as it's sometimes called, isn't just about hearing words, but it's about trying to truly understand the perspective being shared, as well as someone's underlying needs or concerns or fears or desires. Again, this is active listening, focused listening. Also, and maybe most importantly, we need to shift our focus away from winning arguments to understanding different perspectives. Again, an open-minded approach. This might seem counterintuitive, especially in a maybe more competitive workplace. But if you're a long-term thinker rather than a short-term thinker, if you're playing the long game at work and looking at how you can grow in your career, then maintaining positive working relationships is far more valuable than winning any single argument. So let's dive a little deeper into some of these specific strategies that we can implement in our daily work environment. And just as a reminder, in terms of context, the goal isn't to eliminate conflict. That's unrealistic. It's rather to transform it into an opportunity for collaboration and growth. When it comes to communication protocols, I want to focus in on a couple of important concepts that can really transform team dynamics. The first key protocol, which I alluded to just a moment ago, is the reflective listening rule. So what does this rule mean? It's not just about staying quiet while others speak and then reflecting on it internally. Reflective listening protocol requires that team members actually paraphrase back what the previous person said before sharing their own thoughts. For instance, you might say something like, okay, if I understand correctly, you're saying you'd like to extend the deadline to Friday. Something as simple as that. I don't like the phrase, what I'm hearing you say is, I think that's a little condescending, I think it's a little formulaic, so just do it very naturally. Just repeat back, okay, so you're saying you'd like to extend the deadline to Friday. Or, okay, so you'd like to extend the deadline for Friday. So something really, really simple like that. This sort of protocol is incredibly effective at helping people feel heard, that their perspective is valued, which completely counters the perception that one needs to be right, that you need to be right. And reflective listening also ensures that you're actually listening to understand one another, not just waiting for your turn to speak. So it's a great technique for validation, for people feeling like they're getting heard, and also for making sure that you're hearing them correctly. So they have an actual opportunity to say, no, that's not what I said, and they can correct it. The benefits of this technique to both relationships and team cohesion have been shown in multiple papers, and it's quite significant. When team members reflect back what they've heard, it accomplishes several things. Again, it confirms understanding. It shows respect for the other person's perspective. And again, it gives the original person a chance to clarify any misunderstandings immediately so that things aren't misinterpreted or misunderstood for long periods of time. So if something wasn't heard correctly, they have the opportunity to correct you right away. In general, this reflective listening rule or protocol has been shown to dramatically reduce misinterpretations and certainly improve the overall quality of communication between team members. So if you want to create a so-called rule or, a suggested code of conduct for your team for specific meetings or something like that. Again, this is an incredibly important one to consider. Again, really, really effective protocol for communication. Now, another essential protocol to combat our individual tendencies towards rightness, towards being right, is to create an environment that's psychologically safe. When team members feel safe to express their thoughts, to share their uncertainties, their concerns, even to sometimes make mistakes, without the fear of ridicule or punishment, it counteracts or downregulates the feeling that people just need to be right. In other words, if we're in an environment where it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to sometimes be wrong, and everyone is modeling this for each other, that being right is not the absolute highest thing to be. It's not absolutely necessary to be right all the time. Instead, it's safe to be wrong sometimes, or at least to be open to being wrong sometimes. This is an incredibly healthy and positive culture to be a part of. Now, if you're in a supervisory or leadership position, psychological safety really starts with you. When leaders demonstrate vulnerability by openly discussing their own challenges, their own concerns, or their uncertainties, and they encourage input and support from their colleagues, from their employees, from their direct reports, it really sets a powerful precedent for psychological safety. It shows that even as a supervisor or as a leader, you don't always need to be right, that you're open to being wrong or uncertain too. And this is incredibly important for team culture, because people need to know, again, that they can make mistakes, that they can sometimes be wrong, that they can be open to information that would contradict their own, and that it's safe to do that it's not a competition for who needs to be right. And whether you're a supervisor or not, when you're presenting ideas that you think might be controversial or outside the box, or might stir up some debate, you might consider starting with a phrase like, "I'm not sure about this, but here's what I'm thinking." This kind of language, what you might think of as "I'm not necessarily right" language, "I'm not totally sure" language, it can transform team dynamics. It gives people permission to A, give input on your ideas when you present them, and B, to express their own uncertainty and share ideas that they're developing that might not be totally thought out if they're compelled to share those. This approach directly counters the need to always be right. It helps prevent defensive behaviors that can lead to workplace conflict when people are trying to just be right. And in terms of outcomes, a large body of literature looking at the impact of psychological safety suggests that a psychologically safe environment leads to better problem solving, more creative or innovative solution generating, and ultimately stronger team performance. When team members feel safe to challenge ideas constructively and share alternative viewpoints without this fear of humiliation or shame, the entire organization benefits. It benefits from the collective intelligence that emerges from creative and shared perspectives. So super important for many reasons to have a psychologically safe environment. Now, to be clear, psychological safety is not built overnight. It requires consistent demonstration from leadership and regular reinforcement through actions, not just words. So practice, practice, practice. Be open to yourself and open to others being uncertain or even being wrong or making mistakes. And you will, again, counteract our psychological tendency toward rightness, toward being right. Okay, we spent time earlier in this episode discussing cognitive biases and how these reinforce and maybe protect our need to be right. The more we and our colleagues become more aware of this just human universal tendency, these cognitive tendencies, the easier it should be to interrupt them, and hopefully to interrupt their negative effects on relationships and on team cohesion. So how do we increase awareness and understanding of cognitive biases? First, let's take a look at, just a somewhat common practice of training through workshops. If we choose to hold training on building cognitive bias awareness, we want to make these as interactive as possible. That means discussion, maybe some reflective writing, maybe some role play. An interactive approach anytime we're doing training, rather than simply a lecture of some sort, can really help people bring these very automatic or unconscious tendencies to more conscious awareness. And this is crucial for helping employees understand and identify cognitive biases in real-world situations. Also, the hands-on nature of these types of workshops allow participants to practice recognizing biases in a safer, more controlled environment before they encounter them in real-world situations with real potential to damage relationships. We went over several biases that are particularly relevant to the topic of this course, but there are dozens of cognitive biases and mental shortcuts that have been studied over the years in a variety of disciplines, from psychology to political philosophy to economics. So I would suggest doing a bit of research into these, and you might find others that seem appropriate to highlight for your staff. Phenomena like hostile attribution bias or negativity bias or fundamental attribution error, many, many more. Very interesting subject, worth exploring further for sure. At the end of the day, whichever biases you choose to focus on and train staff members about, the ultimate goal of this sort of training is improved decision-making. When teams understand and actively work to counteract their cognitive biases, these mental shortcuts, they can make more objective, hopefully data-driven, logical decisions. Awareness through learning or training is just the first step. The real value, of course, comes from consistently applying these insights in day-to-day operations. So speaking of decision-making, let's walk through some key aspects of structured decision-making processes and why they're crucial for combating our psychological tendency toward rightness. Structured decision-making offers several significant benefits that can transform how teams approach problem solving, especially when there are multiple perspectives and therefore multiple people likely wanting to be right. There are various forms of structured decision making, and I'm not going to dive into each one here too much, but I encourage you to look into these methods. You can search for methods such as a weighted pros and cons list, where you brainstorm ideas, create a pros and cons list of each idea, assign a weight or score to each idea based on pros and cons, and then calculate total scores. There's also a decision matrix, or what's called a PUGH matrix, spelled P-U-G-H, where you would determine the key criteria for evaluating various options like cost or functionality or ease of implementation, and then create a table with options listed as rows and criteria as columns. You can also explore multi-voting. You can explore impact effort matrix, something called a nominal group technique. There's also the Delphi method. Lots of different models for very logical, non-emotional decision-making that considers multiple ideas and perspectives. The reason these tend to be very important is because they reduce emotional and psychological biases that often cloud our judgment during decision-making. More objective evaluations of options means that decisions are hopefully based on facts and data rather than on personal preferences or commitments to proving one's point is correct. Also, having a more transparent decision trail is particularly valuable. Knowing how exactly we arrived at particular conclusions can help us not only justify our choices, but also articulate them in a transparent way to the rest of our team members. And of course, a structured approach allows for more collaborative decision-making. I will say structured decision-making typically requires more time up front, but this investment often pays off. It certainly prevents emotional tug of wars. So to transition into a more structured approach at work can take some time. It can take some team buy-in, maybe even some training for the team as to how to implement these. And especially if people are used to making quick, intuitive decisions, it can feel very costly. But again, the costs pay off. It's usually worth it. Now, in some cases, structured processes might seem excessive for simple decisions. So it's about choosing the right level of structure for each situation. Remember, the goal isn't to make every decision a complex process, but rather to have the right tools available when important decisions need to be made more objectively and collaboratively. In managing people's need to be right, or the general concept of rightness being an element of the workplace, one of the most effective strategies is to actively encourage perspective taking through structured rules and practices. One example, the devil's advocate approach, is particularly powerful. Basically, we formally assign this role to a team member or several team members during discussions and encourage constructive dissent. This sort of structure, again, counteracts the idea that we always need to be right, or that the group's idea is necessarily the right one. When implementing a strategy like the devil's advocate role, we want to make sure different team members take turns playing this role. We don't want any one person from being seen as the constant naysayer, of course. And this rotational position helps everyone develop their critical thinking skills. The person playing devil's advocate should focus on questioning assumptions respectfully, not just being contradictory for its own sake. There should be some logic or reasoning behind the contradiction. And so the person or people in that role would be encouraged to come up with some counter perspectives that have some supporting evidence if possible. Here again, active listening is going to be crucial during these types of exercises. When someone presents an opposing viewpoint, other team members should practice truly hearing and considering their perspective rather than immediately preparing counterarguments. This sort of dynamic might feel uncomfortable at first, but if we do this formally and deliberately, creating a safe space to push back on ideas, it can be extremely helpful in breaking down cognitive biases that lend themselves to blind conformity or to groupthink or to people needing to be right. And one more thing, we want to document the different perspectives that emerge during these types of discussions. Documenting creates a valuable record for decision-making. It helps demonstrate that all viewpoints were considered, even if they weren't ultimately adopted. And it also shows respect for diverse opinions. And this helps build trust among team members. Now, important to remember here, the goal isn't to create some sort of artificial conflict, but rather to ensure that decisions are well-rounded and thoroughly considered. So when team members understand that dissent is valued and protected, they're more likely to speak up when they see potential issues or opportunities for improvement. And this is incredibly important for building teams that are innovative and allowed to think outside the box. Okay, I hope this episode on how our inclination to be right leads to conflict was helpful. Here are my references for the episode. You can pause the video if you like, and of course, you can find them in your supplemental ebook. Please feel free to download your supplemental ebook in the course portal. And as always, let me know if you have any feedback or suggestions at all so I can improve future episodes. Or if you have any suggestions for episode topics, please let me know. Just email me at jeremy@pollackpeacebuilding.com. Thank you for tuning in and see you again soon.